So, our speaker tonight, wrapping up the police and series, Peter VanKoughnett, who is an organizer of Minneapolis-based police abolition nonprofit, MPD 150. And he joined after several years of organizing around policing, beginning after the police murders of Jamar Clark and Philando Castile. MPD 150 is a participatory, horizontally organized effort by local organizers, researchers, artists, and activists. The goal of this initiative is to shift the discussion of police violence in Minneapolis from one of procedural reforms to one of meaningful structural change. By producing a performance review of the whole history of the Minneapolis Police Department at its 150-year mark, they have offered alternative strategies to the failed reforms that are routinely trotted out in response to protest and then methodically sabotaged, undermined, and reversed by an alliance of police leadership, unions, and rank and file. Dismantling the police will require reallocating their budget and assets to support real solutions to community desperation. Good, well-paying jobs, affordable housing, healthy food, empowering education, accessible healthcare, removal of toxins, and more. Ending the brutal police system is, by necessity, a program for a more just and resilient city. So, without further ado, please welcome Peter VanKoughnett. Thank you so much for being here, Peter.
Thanks a lot, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? I hope so. It's VanKoughnett, by the way. Everybody gets it wrong, but...
I'm sorry, yeah, that was a swing in the dark. My bad.
Anyways, yeah, great. Coming in from Minneapolis. Yeah, start by just telling you a little bit about MPD 150, kind of who we are historically and structurally, what our organizing has looked like. So we've been organizing since, 2017, and what didn't exactly form in response to anything in particular. It's any like singular event or anything like that. Largely called like into existence by a local artist and organizer, Ricardo Levins Morales, who's really spearheaded the initial thing. I'm sure he heard me say that. He'd try to like backtrack and be like, oh no, but it was like a mutual thing. It was definitely him putting at least the initial push forward, kind of calling in the right people. So he called in people from really like all across like all kinds of organizers from across Minneapolis, a little bit in St. Paul too. Artists and organizers from a pretty like wide array of the city, trying to like bring a group that was like diverse yet like agreeing on things, and just kind of picking the people that he thought would work well together. So I was actually originally brought in, I mean, I'd already been involved. So I was brought in not only as an organizer, but as an organizer with specific skills in communications and web development, because that's what I've done professionally for a few years. So that's one of the things that I provided the group, but nobody in the group is like, just like does one thing. Everybody's a participating member of the political body, the organizational body. There's nobody who just, does work for the organization or something like that. Yeah, and so it was really, I mean, it was formed with abolition as a core value, and some other principles that went along with that are like ideas about being proactive rather than reactive. So instead of just, I know I was coming out of years of organizing after the killings of Jamar Clark and Philando Castile, where a lot of the organizing that we were doing was following the cases of police violence really closely and supporting families and in supporting their legal cases, and then just like personally and emotionally, and pressuring politicians around those individual cases. And I think that's really important work, but it was also, it can get to be, at least for me, it got to be pretty tiring. And it's like, I think I was really drawn to this, the ideas of this group's organizing. So yeah, being really proactive and like, instead of just reacting to everything that the police department does, instead that we can step back a little and kind of build our own vision and try to build it like as successfully as possible, so that they kind of have to come they kind of have to approach us instead of us approaching them, which has actually ended up really happening, which is amazing. And that it was really, and I think this goes along with it, that the works were like supposed to be nourishing rather than draining. And I really felt that with the group of people that were brought together, that it's like a really good energy in the group. And it's always been a group that I felt good about organizing with. And it's like somewhere I'm excited to show up, which hasn't always been the case with other organizing. And even in this group, when it's like I'm at capacity or I just can't emotionally do it, I think almost everybody in the group has had to step back at some point, and that's like really normalized. They're like, hey, can't do this for now, and other people pick that up, and then they're welcomed back when they show up. And then it's, yeah, and it's about building our own things. It's about dreaming, being really like far-reaching and holistic, and just like really being like, how would we actually want things to be? Like, what's the wildest thing you could ask for, and like taking that as a strategy. Something that Ricardo always said was like, you don't get what you want or like even what you expect to get like by asking for it. You ask for something like twice as crazy, and then maybe they'll give you something like halfway there. So like, yeah, even if we don't get exactly what we ask for, like by putting that target like so far there, like that just has shifted the whole conversation here. Yeah, and like to name a little bit of lineage, like very much this group comes out of the prison abolition movement, groups like Critical Resistance, thinkers and writers and organizers like Angela Davis, Miriam Kaba, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, all those people who've been writing since the 80s mostly. And really most of the like intellectual ideas that we have aren't particularly new. They're just taking like what they were writing and applying it to policing. And also, and they've recognized, and we recognize, that these aren't two separate struggles, because police and prison make up a larger system together and really just feed off of each other. And you really can't, we're discovering that you really can't talk about one without the other. So that's kind of the lineage of the group, is very much in that kind of philosophy and those ideas. And yeah, I think a lot of us just wanted to stop and, okay, I mean, where's I gonna go with that? Anyways, yeah, we had organizers from a lot of different groups, just like put aside it's always been a very horizontal thing, in that there's no specific rules, no specific leaders. Anybody coming from an organization comes as an individual, not as a representative of the organization. In general, there hasn't been any, like, we don't have any staff or anything like that. We have at times hired people for specific tasks for a short period of time that require full-time work or something like that, because it's just too intense to find somebody to volunteer for. But that's pretty rare. We've only just done that a few times. We've operated on kind of a core periphery model. Like, we have a core group of organizers, and then that has usually been between like 8 and 15 people. And then we have a larger group network that's loosely involved with the organization, but isn't necessarily planning things, is more just there as resources or kind of as supporters. And that's, that's more like, 50 to 100 people that are sometimes involved at some other points. So that's just like a little bit of an idea to get an idea about who we are as an organization, the way we operate. And I know a lot of people here are organizers, so just some ideas maybe about how to structure things, how we do that. Another thing, and we didn't define this early on, but we came to define this pretty quickly within the group, is that our group works pretty explicitly, is focused on narrative work, and decided not to do policy or kind of politicking work. Like, because early on we would get a lot of messages from various politicians like, hey, can you meet with us and tell us what to vote for or what to do? Or like, what's your stance on this? Would you like publicly endorse me because I support this? And we strategically decided that like wasn't our role, and that serves a few different purposes. One is like, by not taking specific stances more than that allows us to take a pretty wide view of abolition. And there's that, because there's actually like a lot of different views on what abolition means and how we should work towards that and what policies make sense within the group. So that allows us to be really inclusive about different viewpoints within the abolitionist movement by not being like we're pushing for this specific policy. I think that's one of the main advantages, and just like, yeah, just staying focused and like being about where our group is really about, like building that big vision, and we've let other groups do the work of advocating for specific policies. And we even share over some of our members, like overlap with some of those other groups. You can look up Reclaim the Block, which is a really big group in Minneapolis right now, getting a lot of traction, and Black Visions Collective, and we have members that have been involved with Reclaim the Block since the beginning. It kind of came out of our group along with some other groups. So there's not a clear distinction, but that's more where that work happens. So our core work has been putting out this, where's my copy of it? We have this printed report that we put out in 2018, which is really just, I love it so much. There aren't any copies available right now because they've gone really quickly, but we're actually about to do our second printing of the report in the next few weeks, which is going to be, it's going to be about twice this size. It has a lot of new content. I wasn't even working on that within the group. Other people were working on that. So I just like saw the whole thing, and it's just so much new content, so much good content. I'm so excited about it. And we're getting a lot of copies, and it'll be available online. So you can stay tuned, because I mean, all of this stuff is available on our website, but there is something about, I just love the layout and the feel of this book, and I'm really excited about the new one that we're putting out. So yeah, really our core work has been putting that out, and then doing things to follow up with that. So doing things like remixing that work, putting it into different formats, getting that word out there about that stuff, whether it's making Instagram, doing social media stuff, making different kind of content out of that, and supporting different people doing different things with that. Like people will contact us if they're filmmakers and be like, hey, can we use your content to do this? And like, yeah, of course. And that's been very much the intention since the beginning. So coordinating with that, getting things translated, just getting this out in as many different formats as we can. We organized kind of an exhibit of the work, which is kind of taking that and putting it into like an installation art space that was in 2018, I think. I'm bad at dates. And it had speakers like that. And so that's a big part of our work. And then we do a lot of speaking, and we do a lot of workshops and trainings for groups that want to know how to get better versed in abolitionist ideas, for businesses that want to know how to either eliminate or limit their contact with police and explore alternatives. So helping them brainstorm that kind of stuff, just working with community groups to brainstorm what abolition looks like to them, or like just some exercises around visioning like what abolition actually looks like is something that we do a lot. So a lot of times just working through scenarios like how take a time that you have called the police, or thought about calling the police, or heard somebody call the police, something like that, and imagine what would it take for that situation to look different. Yeah, and I know that you all have been talking a lot about abolition for a few weeks, and I'm really trying to like give the more kind of like on the ground thing, but also like, yeah, injecting our view of abolition for what we're pushing for, like that. I mean, first of all, that abolition is a holistic approach, that abolition is about, first of all, like preventing root causes of violence or harm or anything like that, or things that we call crime, which maybe should or shouldn't be called crime, or should or shouldn't actually be tried to be prevented. But yeah, that first of all, like addressing underlying causes is like, I think the biggest principle of abolition. And then when that's not possible, just looking for resources that de-escalate and resources that are well suited to respond to those particular needs, resources that are accountable to communities in ways that our institutions aren't. Yeah, and so in the report, like it kind of has a past, present, future sections. So the past, which I think is really maybe the most important part of it, is a people's history of the police department in Minneapolis, which is, yeah, really, really detailed and just really lays out that from the beginning it's been a violent institution, like in the early years around class and especially around race. I mean, especially around class actually, and then also around race. And then as it evolved, like really being increasingly racialized in its violence. And so one, just establishing like from the beginning how violent that the institution has been, and there's never been a point at which it hasn't been that. And then second, just tracking kind of the reform movements within the police department or like within the government to try to reform the police department. Just it's just wild. You read about things from the 80s or something like that where they're talking about the exact same things as now, and like the same things people have been talking about implementing. It's like, okay, let's do that. Let's get better training. Let's have citizen review boards. Let's have things like that. And just watching those things fail time after time. And it just really gives a lot of strength to our argument that the police department cannot be reformed away from its core function, which has always been a violent one, and that we are better off scrapping it and starting over with something else entirely that doesn't have that same core function. So in our workshops a lot of time, and then we move into the present situation, which is kind of something that we do, and it has to do with our workshops too. Like we did a lot of interviews with people, mostly workers, and like how that come into contact with the police through their job, whether they're social workers or teachers, something that have to at some point either have called the police or expected to, or just had the police present in their workplace. And using that as like a visioning thing, like, hey, what would you need in order to not have to do that or not to have that happen, or how would that work better for you? So really starting that visioning work concretely of what does abolition look like? How is it already happening in the present moment, and what is needed in order to expand that vision more broadly? I think that we've also like always been like identifying like just the limits of reform, like even like the biggest targets of reform, like even if the reforms were successful, pretty much like, and they were successful, say, in making it so that police didn't kill people, didn't do things like that. We really like try to drive home that really isn't enough. Like even if you can achieve that, which we're very dubious about, but that's still like, even if you had a police department that apprehended people respectfully in a de-escalated way, like where people behaved like model cops or something like that, at the end of the day, they're still just taking people to prison. At the end of the day, they're still just giving people fines. And like, at the end of the day, they're not actually like responding to so many people's needs. They're not serving so many needs, and the things that they can offer us in terms of solutions are still just punitive, torture-based solutions, sending people to prison or financial punishment. So there's not like a reform strategy that gets us to a good place, even if it works the way it's intended. So not only are we like critical of the ability of reforms to go as they say they will, but even just critical of kind of the scope of them, and like that's not anywhere close to enough to what we should be doing. So yeah, we did our report, we put together, and then we've got kind of a future section, which is a bit more about bigger abolitionist ideas and what things that what things might look like in the future, and just a lot of brainstorming around that. We don't try to like set forward a platform, like I've said, but we do just have a lot of ideas meant to get people thinking. And again, all this and so much more is on our website, mpd150.com. If you haven't checked it out, I'd really recommend it. I truly think it's the best resource on police abolition on the internet right now that I've seen. Not only like our initial report, but our resources list is pretty outstanding, and we've really put a lot of work into it. So I think there's a lot to learn there. And yeah, so I think I'll talk a little bit more about where we are in Minneapolis right now. So our group, interestingly enough, like something like 6 months before the uprising, before the murder of George Floyd, like had decided to kind of wind down as a group. Basically, we decided that we published our initial report. We were getting ready to publish the second version of it. And we kind of decided that was going to be our main last work, and then we were gonna, that was kind of the core thing that we got together to do, and that work had been done. And we would figure out some way to keep going in kind of a skeletal way that allows us to keep our resources up there and maybe respond to requests for trainings and workshops, but at a much lower level of involvement. Just because we didn't really like have a clear sense of where to go next, and we all have other involvements in organizing. So that was the decision then. And I think since the uprising, things have felt very different, since things have just taken off and our ideas have entered the mainstream in a way that we didn't expect to happen this soon. All of us are just as surprised as anybody about about what's happened here and how quickly it's happened. So I think I think the trajectory of our group now is a little unclear, because now we've been as busy as ever, still doing the things that we're usually doing. Like we're still just like putting our content out there and doing a lot of speaking and media stuff and consulting with people. So it's the same work, but there's just a lot of demand for it right now. So we're still very busy with that, and we've kind of expedited across the work on the publications that we were working on. So yeah, the state in Minneapolis more generally, like, is, I'm sure you all followed, like, this is like where things got the heaviest, the fastest, like the I guess I'll say disorder in the streets, like like the uprising, rioting, all those things that were happening were extremely intense here. I live just a few blocks, maybe a mile from the precinct, and just a few blocks from where like a lot of that was happening. And I just never, and I was there when the precinct burned and things like that, and I've never seen anything like that scale and that like level of just complete just complete, I guess, I'll say disorder, but it's an order of its own. It's hard to describe but that much property damage happening, or that. And I mean, at the same time, it was in some ways a very calm atmosphere, like, especially because the cops had pretty much just pulled out of the area. It was like, it wasn't a particularly dangerous place to be. About the thing that scared me the most was just like fireworks being set off improperly and flying through the crowd. But it had like a very, in general, like a very festive, and it was kind of felt like a big block party where people were also looting and burning buildings. So I mean, after that happening for a few weeks here, you got the political system responded pretty heavily here and pretty quickly, like more so than some other places. Like one, they did start to respond with like a heavier hand, like breaking up protests, and started to do that where before they'd been laying off a little bit. And two, they took some big steps towards some pretty deep action in a way that a lot of other cities haven't done, and maybe no city has done in terms of our city. In case, like, our city council, a majority of it, a veto-proof majority, pledged to dismantle the Minneapolis Police Department. So that's like a big deal. And now things, and especially since then, things have been a lot quieter here, and especially relative to some other cities like New York, Chicago. I feel like the protests kept going there, and I don't totally understand the dynamics by which things became quieter here, but we're much more in a state now where there aren't big street protests anymore, and there's still a few, and like there was just like they just vandalized the shitty stadium here like a few days ago, like a pretty big crowd of people. there's definitely still stuff happening, but not at all at the same scale that was happening here or that's happening in some other places. And yeah, I don't entirely understand why that happens, but why that's happened, but that might be because there's a lot of political avenues right now for the political system. Like maybe people believe that change can happen within the political system right now. And yeah, I think I think that conflict has now really moved into the political system. Here, it's not like as much on the streets because what the city council pledged to do was wasn't even a binding vote. It was just something a bunch of them pledged to in a public park. So there's very little that's been definitively done here in terms of policy changes. And I shouldn't say that a lot of institutions, the schools and other things have pledged to divest from the police department and their relationships with them. So there actually has been a lot of things that have happened. But in terms of like that step towards the city dismantling the police department, that's still just it's a pledge that's happened. And I think it'll take a year at least until we start to see what that actually means. And I think that I'm very skeptical of all the politicians. So it's like, I think that we have to like keep the pressure on because I think that it'll be very easy for that pledge to like just go undone, for that pledge to become something like, just split it, like taking the budget, like a slight lowering the budget and then forgetting about it. They proposed a new office of public safety to kind of replace the police department. And I think like that could be really good or it could be really bad depending on how things go. Like it really could end up just being the police department by another name. But it also could be like the kind of institution that we're looking for that really is the new kind of institution we're talking about. And I've seen some city council people who seem to be headed in the right direction and some city council people who've said things that really make me think that they're ready to just like send all the cops to a different office and call it something else and then call it a day. And yeah, it'd just be a slightly reformed police department by a different name. So I think all of us are very skeptical about, like, at the same time, like excited about there being this opening for things to happen and like very vigilant about that, how things are going to happen and like knowing, especially like looking at history and knowing that how things can seem to be moving forward in a direction, like how that can get co-opted or snapped away, so that we know that we need to keep the pressure on a lot. And so there's a lot of, we're doing that with our narrative-based stuff, and other groups are more directly organizing politically around those issues. Yeah, there's a lot of pushback here now from all sorts of groups, but especially like from more conservative ones. There's a lot of pro-cop billboards going up across the city, like there's just a lot of response to it. It's kind of hitting that. It took them a while. I think they were really surprised by it, so they weren't prepared. So it's been a few months kind of for them to kind of muster their forces, but there's a lot of money behind that. And so there's a lot of media and things going out about that. Yeah, there's also pushback from other, like there's not an agreement within activist movements here. Like there are people that would rather see like more kind of like the civilian review boards, but with more teeth. Like there are people that are within the activist community that, especially like I think this is coming out in some in certain neighborhoods that like are experience, I'm sure most of these are like this right now. It's summer, unemployment is at a record high, like violence and crime are really high here right now, like they are across the country. And like that's leading a lot of people, especially leaders in communities that are like really affected by that, I think it's really hard for them right now to imagine like not having police, even though all this has happened with like police there. But there's a lot of different threads here. So the political scene is complicated. So it's not that like everybody clearly agrees with abolitionist ideas. There's a lot of people that do, and the main change has been like this entered the mainstream. Like now, instead of like being pro-reform or anti-reform, now like you're either pro-reform or pro-abolition, and like those are kind of the two viewpoints within the city. Like everybody has to orient themselves towards abolition, whether they're saying why they don't quite want that but want a lot of change, or saying they actually want that. So yeah, I think something big is going to come out of it. I don't know what it's going to be, but that's kind of where we're at right now. And I think I am running out of steam for things to talk about. So I'd welcome some questions.
Yeah, so thank you for that. So in your experience talking with like everyday folks, what do you think is the best way of going about trying to discuss abolition? Because I know personally before having talked with Alex Vitale, who was kind enough to come to our chapter last summer, when I heard abolition, I was like, no, all like the typical responses. And I wonder what your experience is with how you approach the topic with like regular people who don't know much about the subject.
Yeah, most of my experience is like talking to the communities that I come from. So it's like talking to like white liberals about it. And so that's like, I think mostly the perspective that I have on like how to, or like I can share about what's worked well for me. And yeah, I think I like usually just like ask them like what their perspective on it, like what some of their fears are about it, like what makes them resistant to it. And a lot of times like the things they say, like it's like, yeah, I mean, I feel those things too. I have those same fears and some of those same doubts like that. I mean, I've felt all those things before, so they're very familiar to me, but I also have like, I think I'm always able to like throw in some idea that they haven't thought about, or like a lot of times just clarify what we mean by abolition. Because I think a lot of times, and I think this is starting to change in this city in particular, like as the abolitionist movement grows stronger and our message gets out there, like what we actually mean by that we don't actually mean just like get rid of the police and don't do anything else, and that's like just what we're doing. So yeah, I think usually like just like clarifying things, but also yeah, just finding ways to kind of puncture ideas or just question those feelings, just bring up new ideas. And it's always a slow process. Like I've had the most success like when it's been like an extended period of conversations with people that I grew up with, because it's hard to change people's minds about things. So
kind of on that same topic, I think like you said, there are a lot of people who will agree with the fundamental reasoning or ideology behind like abolish the police, but they struggle to kind of take that next step of imagining what a police-free future could look like. And maybe you kind of just addressed this, but what would you say to the people who agree with you on a fundamental level, but don't feel quite ready to like take that next step?
yeah, I think that's when like some of the like concrete work we've been doing, like around brainstorming works, and like some of the, I can always get, I can always get people like some, always starting with like some basic things that I've never had anybody be like, yeah, that isn't obvious. Or just like, of course, like police shouldn't be responding to mental health things, to drug crises. Like we already have people that are trained to respond to that, and they could be dispatched instead. Maybe there needs to be more of them. Maybe they need to be better funded, but like those already exist. And like everybody I talk to is like, yeah, that's like it's kind of a no-brainer. So starting there, and then just like, yeah, using that, and like these exercises are super helpful for like, and there are things that I still have to do when like there's intense things that happen in my neighborhood. Like what how do we want to respond to this? Like, what is needed in this, or like, what is needed so that we don't have to respond to this? And also just, and taking stock of like what happens now, like what are the police actually doing when this happens? Is this actually preventing this from happening? Is this just punishing somebody, or is it not even, are they not even showing up in this situation? So yeah, I think just starting to like break apart these individual scenarios is really helpful for people. And then I think once you kind of get that train moving, and I think it's a lot of people will get to this point of like, a lot of people see the core function of police as, you know, doing as like forceful intervention in violent situations, which I'd argue it really isn't. Like, that's a very small and rare part of what police do. Usually police are spending most of their time like on like drug crimes and parking tickets and speeding not parking tickets, more like speeding tickets and things like that. Like, and when they are responding, and a lot of times like, and a lot of time like domestic violence stuff, but usually when they're responding, they're not like directly stopping that violence. They're showing up after the fact. And so this image we have of like cops intervening to prevent violence is like pretty skewed, and I think that's something that they've played up, because I think that actually pretty rarely happens. So, but I think it is important to acknowledge that's like a lot of people's sticking point, that they can't imagine what it would look like to have anybody else do that. And I think something that I like say is like, and I think that's where there's like disagreements within our group about what that looks like. I think like some abolitionists are more opposed and some are more accepting of that there might be some class of public servants that do use force in situations. They may or may not be armed, like, and so they may have that in common with a police officer. And I think that then there's other people that maybe are more like in favor of more decentralization of that, and are like pretty skeptical of that being like a centralized government institution that does those things. So I think just like engaging with people that are skeptical around those conversations, be like, yeah, like those things don't exist yet, like at least not on the scale. And those are the kinds of things that we need to, as a community, talk about how we want them to work. But there's a lot of things that do exist, and then there's some things that don't exist, and acknowledging that.
So, and how important is working with other groups, do you think, on these kind of projects? I imagine there's a lot of crossover with organizations like Black Lives Matter. Do you find that, I mean, I guess it's always important. I'm trying to kind of think, like, where do you see like the abolitionist movement in relation to other movements? Because it does like kind of cross over in some ways, like you're saying with drug abolition. We had a sex worker on last time, Kaylin Bailey. Do you folks work with a large group like that, or how do you see organizing in that regard?
Yeah, I think we tend to like, I think that has to do with like our avoidance of policies and kind of politicking, but we tend to, and like also like our horizontal structure, that we tend to stay away from like major nonprofits and things like that in the city. We don't really work with them. But yeah, we definitely get a lot of inquiries, yeah, like from like drug legalization folks, from prison abolition folks, and we try to incorporate that, and we like will share some of their stuff and have their stuff shared. So we try to like, yeah, build friendships between the groups. And yeah, we have two groups that we partner with more closely in the city, and that's Reclaim the Block, which I particularly mentioned before, which does more policy work, and then Black Visions Collective, which is a lot of folks that were involved in Black Lives Matter Minneapolis, or at least several. So which doesn't really exist as Black Lives Matter Minneapolis doesn't really exist as an organization anymore. So, uh, yeah, and they're doing some similar work to reclaim the block. And so, yeah, we definitely partner with them and kind of coordinate strategically with them without like, and we'll share their stuff sometimes, but also like make it clear that that's not our work. So yeah, I think we kind of stay in our own lanes, but support each other where it makes sense and coordinate with each other when it makes sense.
And so building off of that, with specifically your collaborations with Reclaim the Block and Black Visions Collective, I know you said the MPD 150 is currently working on getting the second version of the report out, but what is MPD 150? I mean, and maybe it's like a collective effort, but what is MPD 150 focusing on now in terms of like strategic next steps, maybe with Black Visions Collective and Reclaim the Block? Like, are there other things they're also working on in addition to the second version of the report, or is it more all hands on deck for that?
Yeah, not really. Like, I mean, the same kind of like media stuff and just like narrative work. But yeah, like in terms of like a strategic direction in terms of like pushing policy and things like that, like, no, we aren't really involved with other groups in those conversations. That's kind of like, yeah, that's kind of the work that we're doing, that those groups are doing. And I feel like we're aware of that direction, but the group always feels like because it always has this kind of like past, present, future thing. And it always kind of has like that we have since the beginning. And like, we're not like, yeah, we haven't been just like changing that much based on the tides of what's happening. So like, really, we just had this message since the beginning. We're still just like driving it out there, and there's new avenues and working it up that way, and we put it in new contexts, but we're still just trying to get the same message out there that we have since the beginning.
And so I know you said that MPD 150 doesn't really focus on policy, and so maybe they wouldn't go this route in the future, but is there, I guess it's a two-part question. One, does MPD 150 still plan on kind of like dissolving and quieting down after the second version of the report comes out? And two, if not, are they planning on either participating in or maybe leading the charge on keeping public pressure on the city council to follow through with the pledge they made to dismantle MPD? Or is that not really their sphere of action?
Yeah, I don't really see us doing the latter. It seems like there's already other groups doing that, and that's like just never been something we've done. And I think if we did, we'd probably like start a new group and give it a new name, even if it was a bunch of the same people. Yeah, and as for like whether we're actually like sunsetting, as we've been saying, like that's literally been an agenda item that we've been tabling on every meeting pretty much since the uprising started, because we just like, yeah, it's a big conversation that we keep not having time for. So we'll get around for it. We'll get around to it. Stay tuned.
So that's kind of interesting. In the sense, like, what have you, as an organizer, do you do, here, let me ask this first. Do you participate with other organizations? I think you said a lot of people in the organization do, correct?
Yeah.
What are the discussions like as like a group that just focuses on narrative building? What are the lessons like that maybe a group like DSA could take about not necessarily doing politicking, but about building up like a knowledge base or building up some kind of educational program that you maybe being part of other groups have seen more politically active groups lacking? Sorry if that was worded weirdly.
Yeah, and again, like I don't want to like. I think it's more of a matter of like an organization just like being clear about what they're trying to do and not doing everything, like, and maybe having more organizations doing more targeted stuff. So I'm not trying to say like every organization should only be a narrative change organization, because that's like the real way change happens or something like that. Like I don't really have that kind of like theory about it. It's just what this group was brought together to do, and it's kind of our corner of what's going on. So yeah, and I think that there is value to that. I mean, yeah, I don't know. I'm not trying to give DSA advice. I don't know. Hopefully you can get some ideas from it, but yeah, I mean, I think that I was in socialist alternative back in high school and a little bit in college. So I'm like vaguely, and I know DSA is like different, but probably not that different. So yeah, like, I mean, it's always, I always kind of liked that there was like a two-pronged approach to that group. Like, I always really enjoyed the theory. I've always been, especially at that point in my life, I was more of like a political theory nerd. And like, that was like a really good place for me to interact with other people who are really interested in theory and things like that. And yeah, and that there was an action side to it. Honestly, in the groups that I was involved with, the action side was like a little lacking. So yeah, I think just like being clear about what your group is and what you're doing, and then like kind of like sticking to that, I think it is my idea.
So we have a question here that says, I have a question in relation to abolition work and how that plays out with gun reforms and gun rights. I think often of how fears of parents with school shootings and with disagreements even among socialists about what that realm looks like with police abolition. So I guess what would police abolition kind of look like with people owning guns, and especially fears over like school shootings that have happened, and I guess situations where an armed response might be the first thing that people think of to certain situations like that.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's when I talked about there not being like an agreement within the movement or even within our group about that. Like, I can imagine a few different things, and each of them have their own like kind of strengths and weaknesses. One is like having a subset of public servants employed by the city that are trained in intervening in situations with force, and maybe are like in that situation would probably be armed, like that could intervene in those situations. And then the other that like, I think like the other vision that I hear, and I think there's spectrums in between, is more like community organized self-defense, and maybe like this is coming maybe a bit more out of anarchist traditions, but this is something else that's been happening in Minneapolis in a really fascinating way. And I don't know how much this has been like nationwide too, but at the same time that the uprisings and all these protests started, there was also a lot of mutual aid networks, and all across our city, like especially across like these neighborhoods, there are neighborhood groups popping up that popped up around like mutual aid, around community self-defense, and so like what roles like those groups, and so that's another place I'm active in, is in like this group that really just organizes around the few people that the few blocks that I live around, like what ways can we intervene? So I think there's some people that would rather see like a lot of the intervention, even like armed intervention, like happen on that level, on this like block level. But obviously that has its own problems, like problems of vigilantism and like replicating like structures of racism that operate outside of like institutions, like the vigilantism that's always happened within our countries. So that's a problem. Whereas the institutions kind of have the problem of like replicating the kind of violence that's been happening there. So I don't know where I think my personal position is like somewhere in between. I feel like I've always been like a little bit between the two camps in terms of like being a government focused socialist and like a more of an anarchist leaning thing. So I think there's a lot of perspectives, and I think that's a lot of the conversations that we're going to be having here in the next year, because they're really complicated, especially with there being so many guns in this society. Like if people didn't have so many guns, it'd be a lot simpler.
Another question from someone in our audience. He says, I still see people trying to change the slogan from defund the police to reform the police. How can we get people to understand that reform is a never-ending incremental cycle that is really just a Band-Aid?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where like one of the main benefits that our organization has had about bringing in history, like to just like talk, to be able to, not only say that, but just like go through every 5-year cycles and be like, no, this happened. This has been happening since the 80s, these cycles of reform, and just seeing how familiar that is. And I assume it's the same way in other cities. I don't know the police department history elsewhere like I do here, but like, yeah, I think like that. And then, yeah, like the things that we do for narrative, like, so one, like building that narrative, building your materials, kind of building your argument and your information, and then the different methods that we've been using to get that information out. Like we've been, we've worked with a lot of artists. We've worked with just like getting all kinds of media stuff to get our message out in a lot of different ways, so it reaches a lot of different people. So everything from op-eds to art installations to videos to I don't even know what else. Yeah, we've done a lot of stuff. So just getting it out in a lot of different ways and like keeping it really creative and fun. But also just doing your research first and having like your core resources being really solid.
Around slogans, some of the criticisms we've been hearing from people is like, oh, well, you say defund the police or abolish the police, and that's going to be too confusing because people are going to think about taking that money away or, completely abolishing the police and then not having a second step. And so there's been a whole conversation, and like you talked about as well, that it's really like a two-step process of defunding the police and taking that money, but actually using it and reinvesting it back into the communities and social services that need it. But one of the, and it adds a layer of complexity, and forgive me if this is, oh, sorry, what?
I was making a joke. Yeah, that's what we need, a slogan like that, like abolish the police and replace it with da-da-da-da-da, something, but it's like 20 words long. So
exactly, it's just way too clunky to put into I mean, some people have said defund police, refund communities. That could be something good. But yeah, there's still a few in the works. But one of the conversations that has come up with this discourse is that when we're taking that money and reinvesting it back into certain institutions, we also have to use a critical eye in looking at those institutions to ensure that they are representing and helping the people, and especially the marginalized communities that they claim to be helping and representing. And that if there is some form of institutional racism within those structures, then that's going to lead to a messy and complex process of like, okay, well, now we have this money from the police, but we need to do like a whole restructuring of how this organization is running. I guess generally speaking, like, do you have any thoughts on what that process might look like in a situation where many people are already a little like hazy about what defunding and refunding is going to look like, and then adding on that other layer of, well, instead of just moving it and then calling it a day, we actually need to look at these institutions as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said that really well. Yeah, I mean, you study history anywhere, I think the police are a really egregious institution, but there aren't many institutions in this country that aren't full of institutional racism. And so, yeah, like using this reinvestment, like not having an illusion that like abolishing the police will eliminate racism in this country or anything like that. That anti-racist work goes a lot farther than that. And yeah, that even just reinvestment without an anti-racist lens, like, is potentially really damaging also. So doing as much as we can to minimize that. Yeah, I think you said a lot of that.
I'm kind of curious, and I think if you can't answer this in relation to your group, maybe you can answer this like historically. When you're engaged with this kind of work, there's always the potential of kind of police retaliation. How does your group deal with that, and how have groups that you research deal with that? I know, like with Black Lives Matter and Ferguson, I think there's been a lot of, I think maybe the the kind of politically correct way, disappearances of activists have occurred. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are, just from the study of history and from your own activities in this area.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of us are like, operating pretty above ground with our real names. Like, if people want to track us down, like, they probably can. And so that's pretty scary. Like, in some ways, like, I feel like we haven't, like, and we've had people surveilled by private security companies, things like that. I don't think we've seen any evidence of the government doing it, not that they aren't, but yeah. I don't know if I have an answer for you. I'm like, you kind of say, I'm like, yeah, we probably should be doing more. I guess I'm more concerned about, I'm not concerned about like the Minneapolis Police Department as much as I am about like either like extra governmental, like vigilante kind of, more like extra governmental agents, or like CIA kind of stuff. Like, I just got somebody, I'm like up on one of the big like pro police websites now. They have like a picture of me and my name and quoting me. It's a cute picture, so like that's nice, and it's actually a good, at least they like picked a good quote. I was like, okay, I appreciate that, like, you picked like actually a pretty solid quote out of the thing I wrote, and like grabbed a cute picture of me off my Facebook. But like, it's still like, yeah, it's hard. I feel like I've been a bit more public lately, and that's a little scary for me and other people. There's a lot of people in our group who have a lot of knowledge about that, who have, Ricardo started his organizing with the Black Panthers. Like, and so that's kind of like, there's a lot of people in our group are all too familiar with that. So I'm hoping that they'll have some ideas, because it's like, and I've dealt with that in other contexts, but yeah, I don't know how prepared we are for that kind of thing right now, to be real.
We have another question here. How would you suggest we approach organizing protests on defunding the police and anti-racism in a community that heavily supports the community policing narrative and might be against kind of defunding and abolition? Yeah.
So I do want to double check, like, in what way you're using community policing, because I've heard that used. I hear that used a lot of different ways lately. What it usually means to me is like a specific movement that started in the 90s, 80s. I'd have to look in the report. The Campaign Zero reforms. Okay, so that's a little different, because like, yeah, there's community policing. What's open door policy? Yeah, because there's okay, one, community policing often means like, oh yeah, well, I think like what I said before is like a good talking point. Like, even the most like far-reaching, yeah, like Campaign Zero, like, even if we have like cops that are behaving as model cops and are like de-escalating any situations, and they don't beat people up, and they don't kill people, like, and they treat everybody respectfully, at the end of the day, they're still just fining them and taking them to prison. And like, at the end of the day, there's still so much that they're not, and also like having it be like, not just like, what can we stop the police from doing, but talk about all the things that the police aren't doing, like all that I feel like it's really like ridiculous right now. Like a lot of the, because like violence is up here right now. A lot of the pro-police movements are like, violence is way up. Like all this abolition stuff is like causing this. I'm like, no, like they haven't actually defunded the police department. This is like business under like a police, like the system of policing. Like this is the system that we have like failing to prevent this violence and a lot of this stuff happening. So like, this is your problem. This isn't our problem. This is not our system at work. This is your system at work. So yeah, I think just like, yeah, I think like, yeah, one, like being like, like looking at cycles of reform and like highlighting like just the inertia of the institutions and being like, all attempts to like reform these institutions have just backfired. And like, I don't think there's a good reason to expect that we're going to suddenly be successful in like getting a bunch of cops mostly from the suburbs, like with a lot of like racism and trauma in the department, to like start behaving differently and not being as violent or towards people and as aggressive towards people. Like, I don't think that that's likely to happen. But even if it does happen, that it's not really that great of an objective. We're still just like, there's still just like agents of a system of mass incarceration. And that's not where we want to be. That's not where we want to get to.
So I have one more question, I think, to close us out. So one of the lines on MPD 150's website says, "We hope that the process we are developing will help organizers in other cities to establish practical abolitionist strategies." So if you were to kind of give advice to people in other parts of the country who are looking to engage in abolitionist struggles, what do you think would be some good ways to get started, or maybe to stage some actions, or just to kind of get involved with that in any sort of effective way?
Yeah, I mean, you're free to copy our model. Like, if you want to do that narrative change work, like, you know, do the research, write the history of your organization, of your cities, of policing in your city. Like, start visioning things that are applicable. And maybe it's not a city, maybe it's in a rural community, maybe it's something like that, and start, you know, visualizing and brainstorming the alternatives and ideas that are applicable to your city. Because maybe there's, or community, if it's not a city, like maybe, especially if it's not a city, like a lot of the things that we're talking about might not apply the same way. So yeah, I think like you're free to like take a lot of things from our model. Like I feel pretty good about how like we've done things, and I think it's been really effective. So I think that's a good place to start. And yeah, that's kind of what that line's about, is like, we hope that other people will maybe not do the exact same thing, but like, yeah, we've been excited to like hear about people doing some parallel projects in other cities. So I don't think anybody's been like, we're doing this exact thing.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for coming and giving this talk. We really appreciate the work you folks have done, and just going over your website, I tend to agree. It is a really, really good website with a lot of great resources, and I know I'm going to definitely direct people to that. So I appreciate you coming here, and again, all the work you folks have done and being part of this series. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Peter. Really appreciate you being here. And I think that will just about do it for us. This is the end of the Policing Society series. The rest of the videos are up on the Cape Cod DSA's YouTube channel. And yeah, thank you for watching.